and welcome to this AGM. The AGM proper begins at 11:30, but nevertheless, I will remind you, as Sam has told you, that the day is being streamed live. It's open to all who click on the link, so we're bringing U3A to the movement. Please do remember this when asking your questions. We are on show, and we must bear that in mind. For those of you who were here on Tuesday, you will remember that we gave out Chairman's Certificates of Recognition. We have 3 more to give out before we start anything else. And the idea of these certificates is that they're celebrating your milestone. It's when the milestone has been reached in the past year. And this is, people were getting quite concerned that they'd been missed out. But it is the day, from the day on which they were registered as full members of the trust, which is not always the same day as the day the U3A was launched. I think there are 3 more to be presented. I hope the people are here. Long Eaton and District U3A reached the milestone of 10 years. Is there someone who can come and pick up the certificate, please? Would you like to come down? And this time, can you please make sure that you use these steps? Say no more. It seems to have been a very popular innovation, so we will continue with that. And now I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today, Jo Coleman. Jo advises across a range of charitable activities. With the Charity Commission becoming a more active regulator, Jo has advised numerous charities who face questions from the Commission or who are subject to a Section 46 inquiry. Sounds awful, doesn't it? She is Vice Chairman and member of the Executive Committee of the Charity Law Association and chaired the Working Party on the Charities Protection and Social Investment Act and gave evidence to the Joint Scrutiny Committee in the House of Lords. Jo lectures on issues of charity law and writes regularly for the sector press. She also serves as a school governor. So behave. Jo gave the opening address at last year's Charity Law Conference and regularly lectures and writes on matters of charity law and governance. She is speaking to us on Gruesome Governance. So welcome, Jo.
Charity governance. I'm a charity lawyer, and I've been a charity lawyer for about 18 years. It probably doesn't bode well for the next hour or so, so you might have to sort of keep pinching yourself to stay awake, but I will do my best. I love the fact that your slogan for this conference, and I think maybe generally, is learn, laugh, and live. And what I'm going to try and do, as we are live, so I've got the live bit right, I'm going to try and tell you something about charity governance, but more than that, I'm going to hopefully make you laugh, tell you some of the stories that I've encountered over the last 18 years in charity governance, and to explain to you why charity governance actually is really interesting. Now, I can see I can see you're all skeptics, so you're going to have to bear with me. Firstly, let me just tell you a little bit about where I am at the moment and what I'm doing. So I work as a partner in a law firm in London called Bond Dickinson LLP. Bond Dickinson is a national law firm, so we've got 8 offices through the country. So we have offices in Plymouth, Southampton, Bristol, London, Leeds, Newcastle, which is the sort of the hub. It's our largest office up in Newcastle. And then Edinburgh, which is our newest office, and also in Aberdeen. So we're through the country, and because of that, we get to work with all charities of all different shapes and sizes. And I have to say that I think I've got the best job in the world. I am incredibly lucky. So we work for charities big and small, all the way from the big boys like the National Trust and the RNLI, all the way through to religious organisations. So I work for congregations of nuns. I work with Sikh temples and Muslim charities, all the way through to medical research charities, universities, schools, communal organisations. But I actually have rather a soft spot for charitable movements like U3A. So when Sam asked me to present today, I happily agreed. I have to tell you that my husband was a little less impressed, because today is my wedding anniversary. He sent me a picture of some flowers last night. And I was really excited until I read the WhatsApp message underneath, which says the flowers are from my parents, because they know they know my husband never bothers. Anyway, it's my 19th wedding anniversary, which apparently, when I looked it up last night, is my bronze wedding anniversary. But today, ta-da, I am going for gold, because Pam set me a challenge last night, and I absolutely love a challenge. She told me how absolutely brilliant yesterday's speaker was. Well, that's great, thanks, Pam. And I understand that he was talking to you about the paranormal. So I decided to talk to you about something much more scary. Gruesome governance. It might be scary because, as Paul told me, I don't know where Paul is, but he told me in the bar last night that I'd have a job to make that interesting. Or it may be scary because actually charity governance is really, really hard to get right. And when it goes wrong, it can be quite difficult to fix. So let's have a look. U3A, a movement, just to remind us all, I guess, the Third Age Trust, the umbrella body, all of you in this room, I think are members of the executive committees of your local U3As, is that right? So, no? Okay, so how many members of executive committees have we got in the room? Can we have some hands up? Okay, put your hands down if you're, oh, not yet. Put your hands down if you're not also a charity trustee. Oh. Okay, all your hands are staying up, aren't they? Because if you're members of the executive committee, you're also charity trustees. Excellent. Phew, got over that one. So what is governance then? Let's have a look. Governance, it's been in the news again this week. Theresa May, as you may recall, said lots of things about the way in which companies in this country were being run and how the bosses were taking advantage of the workers and how she was going to sort of set governance straight. And she consulted on a range of packages, and this week the government's response to that consultation was presented. In that context, you'll have read in the papers this week that the focus is very much on pay ratios and the difference between the CEO's pay and their workforce pay, which I think is something like 6 times greater than it was even 10 years ago. But many of the sort of more difficult ideas, I suppose, to put, for example, employee representatives onto company boards, they've gone. So governance these days is big news. You probably will remember 2 years ago a lady called Camilla Batman-Gelich. Okay, so she ran a charity called Kids Company, and the spectacular failure of Kids Company has brought charity governance front and centre. She has actually made my life much easier. Because when I explain to people that charity governance matters, they now begin to understand why. You'll remember the spectacular collapse in July 2015, which made front page headlines for very many weeks. And if you're a Newsnight freak like I am, they did a sort of series of investigative journalism pieces, which actually in the end probably caused the ultimate collapse of the Kids Company. But Kids Company had received more than £46 million in government funding. And although government officials over many years had been expressing concerns about Kids Company, about its governance, about the way it was managed and its business model, the pressure that the very charismatic Camilla Batman-Gelich brought to bear, personally I think, on David Cameron and his team, just kept the cash rolling in, to the point where £3 million was released to Kids Company in the weeks before it collapsed. Now, such a serious and catastrophic failure has led to a series and succession of inquiries into Kids Company. So we've had the National Audit Office look at it, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee has looked at it, the Public Accounts Committee has reported. BEIS and the DTI are currently looking at whether or not to disqualify the directors of Kids Company from serving in the future as company directors. And then the Charity Commission will be bringing up the rear. And when everybody else has finished reporting, the Charity Commission will be publishing its inquiry. And I don't know if you saw, but the DTI announced 2 weeks ago that they do intend to bring prosecutions for disqualification proceedings against the former trustees of the Kids Company. The trustees, of course, very notably included Alan Yentob, who was also a very high public profile chairman, and he had to leave his role as creative director at the BBC as a result of the failings of Kids Company. There, of course, are charity failures all the time, but that was the biggest and the most spectacular. And as a result of the pressure and the public concern that's arisen from Kids Company, that in the last 2 years there's been a renewed focus, both by the regulator, by sector bodies, and also by the national media and other pressure groups to try and do something about charity governance. So those reports, the 6 reports I mentioned, have looked at some of the key issues and the failures of Kids Company. They looked at reserves, impact measurement, because so it is said that Camilla was claiming that she was supporting 30,000 children, and the way she got there was that if she supported one child and that child was slightly better behaved when they were in class, she claimed all the 30 other children that were in that child's class. So the way in which we report our impact needs to be more transparent. But I think for me, the real lesson of Kids Company is a little bit more basic. That's just simply as charity trustees, trustees have a duty to act prudently and to exercise sound judgment. You have to apply common sense, behave reasonably. You need to be responsible, reasonable, honest, and you also have to act with reasonable care and skill. And it doesn't matter that the role is voluntary and it's unpaid, and you're doing it because you love it in your spare time. It doesn't mean that you don't have legal duties and responsibilities as charity trustees. And you need to be confident in your role as charity trustees to understand what your duties are. Now, when Sam and I were talking about what I was going to present on this morning, I could have done a session on trustees' duties and responsibilities, but that's even more tedious than governance. So what I would ask you to do is, when you go home, there is a very, very good guide that was reproduced by the Charity Commission about 18 months ago. It's called CC3, the Essential Trustee. I'm sure Sam is signposting it to you all the time. But it sets out the 6 main duties of charity trustees, which are to ensure that your charity is carrying out its purposes for the public benefit, to comply with your charity's governing document and the law. And when I'm in a room like this and I ask people the last time they saw their charity's governing document, there's sort of normally lots of shuffling and heads go down. To act in your charity's best interests, to manage your charity's resources responsibly, to act with reasonable care and skill, and to ensure that your charity is accountable. And that's it. It's really not that difficult in theory. Of course, the practice sometimes is a little bit harder. And there's been a lot of work, as I said, undertaken in the sector looking at charity governance and how to improve it. But the problem with, and in fact, there's been a new charity governance code. If there's any charity governance freaks out there, you may have seen the new governance code, which was launched, I think, on the 11th of July. And it's a really good document. I think you can go on charitygovernance.org.uk and look it up. There is a charity governance code for smaller charities, which is really good, and I would thoroughly recommend it to you. The problem for me is that codes of governance are really, really dull. And so if I spoke to you about the code of charity governance for the next hour, I would lose most of you in an instant, and I really don't want to do that. So Sam saw me give this presentation about 5 or 6 years ago, and she really liked it, because I'm looking at it from the wrong angle. This is, as sort of I've said, entitled Gruesome Governance, and I'm going to look at some of the problems. Some of the problems I've encountered along the way, and to unpack those. So this isn't a wholesale look at charity governance. This is not everything you need to know, but it's a starting point, and hopefully it will give you enough ideas. And then I've referred at the back of the packs, which you'll have later, to the core principles set out in the new Charity Governance Code. So governance is concern with the way in which charities are directed and controlled. It's about what the board of charities do and how they set the values of and is distinguished from the day-to-day operational management of the charity by full-time executives, which of course in your context doesn't quite apply. And it's the systems and processes concerned with ensuring the overall direction, effectiveness, supervision and accountability of an organisation. The purpose of good governance, I've already explained, but as you see the Charity Commission there saying good governance matters to us as a regulator because it promotes compliance with the law and has a strong bearing on a charity's effectiveness in achieving its mission. Good governance in charities is therefore not an added bonus, it's at the heart of what makes charities successful. And conversely, the Commission's casework demonstrates that basic failures in governance are often at the root of various serious problems. So when the Charity Commission opens an inquiry because something's gone very badly wrong, there are almost always governance failings along the way. So rather than looking at the code, I have decided to sort of work along the guidelines of something called the Compass-CAS governance model, because governance is a little bit intangible. You know, what is it? What are we actually talking about? What am I referring to? And the Compass-CAS governance model splits it out in 4 ways. Now, this isn't the right way. There are many, many different ways of looking at governance in all types of organisations. But for me, I understand this model and I like working with it. So it breaks it down into structures. So there's the fixed architecture that supports the other elements of governance. That's the processes, the methods organisations use to hold management to account and review their own processes. Meetings, the conduct of which I think is absolutely central to governance, and behaviours, the way people relate to each other and are contributing to governance. And this is what the model looks like then. So under each of those 4 headings, structures, processes, meetings and behaviours, you can see the various different constituent elements which come together, all together to form the governance of any organisation. So under structures, you've got your board size, your terms of office, term limits, the committee types, your advisory groups, all of the different systems structures that you put in place to make it work. Under processes, You've got succession planning, recruitment, appointment, diversity, induction, skills and experience, chair selection, committee chair selection, governance, risk, performance evaluation, all of these different processes that help make your charity effective. Meetings is a really interesting one. I think you can tell a lot about the effectiveness of a charity just simply by turning up at a board meeting and seeing the way in which the trustees interact with each other, the types of questions they're asking, their interaction with the paid chief executive and staff, and the way in which that relationship is going. And I would hazard a guess that if you put me in a boardroom, even if you didn't tell me whether the charity was successful or not, I could work out how the charity was doing from that level of interaction. Board meetings are absolutely critical because it's where you as charity trustees do most of your business. That's where it happens. That's where you take decisions. That's where you plan for the future, set out your strategy for the next year and determine how things are going to go forward. And then on the end is the most difficult to correct, but actually when things are going really wrong, it's because people aren't behaving properly. So we're going to have a look at some of that as well. So the way this works is like this. I'm going to set out a particular problem. I've got 11 of them in total, so don't panic, but broadly speaking, there's a number at the top of each one. You'll know how far through we are and decide whether to go to sleep or not. Going to look at the issue in context, what the Charity Commission says about it, what broader sort of governance experts say about it, and then hopefully give you a little bit sort of practical tips in dealing with it. Now, there may be, in fact, probably most of you sit on charity boards that are perfect. And in which case, I'm really, really sorry. You are going to learn nothing from me today. But, you know, there may just be little snippets here or there that you're able to take away with you to think, do you know what, that's not a bad idea. I might give that a go and see if we can make this really effective. So here we go. Number 1, the burgeoning board. Oh, I should say, alliteration makes things fun. Who knew? You'll see as I go through alliteration, it's good. The burgeoning board, the board that's just simply got too big, because the problem is we don't really want to exclude anyone. They're all giving their time for nothing, and she's so nice. She makes fantastic tea, and he always brings a freshly baked cake. How could we ask him to step down? And also, you know, we're all on the executive committee here, so if we leave him out, that wouldn't be fair, right? And you know, surely it won't affect our effectiveness as charity trustees. You know, we're just a group of friends. You know, and that may well be the case, but let's have a look at the burgeoning board. Because the problem is sometimes boards become too large and they're too large to be effective. Now, many years ago, how many years ago is it now? Probably about 7 or 8 years ago, I worked on the merger that formed a charity now known as Age UK. You may be familiar with it. And it's public, so I'm not breaching any confidentiality, but the former charities were Help the Aged and Age Concern England. And Age Concern England had set up a programme called Heyday, which was going to be a membership scheme which was designed to rival Saga. And I think you can still get the report into the Heyday fiasco on the internet if you Google for it. It was written by Sir Christopher Kelly. Essentially, over the course of about 5 years, Age Concern England spent, and I know that we're being live streamed and recorded and all sorts, so caveat, I think about £20 million on Heyday, which at the end of 5 years had no more than a few thousand members. And it was an unmitigated disaster. And one of the things that the Charity Commission did when it went in and conducted a case review into the losses that had been suffered by Age Concern England on Heyday is they looked very carefully at the size of the board. And Age Concern England's board at the time was somewhere between about 30 and 40 members. And the reason it was so large was, you know, justifiable when was explained to you, because there was a representative from here and a representative from there, and this person was responsible for that, and we need all of these people on the board. The problem is you might need all of those people on the board, but you don't need 38 people round a trustee table. Now, I see it with medical research charities because with a lot, for example, of the Royal Colleges, they do have very large councils. But whether or not trustee bodies can make effective decisions when you have that many people round a table, I'm just not convinced. It's very difficult to have an open and clear debate, to hear everyone's voices and to make clear decisions. And so normally what happens in boards that are larger sizes is that they become almost like a sort of rubber stamping type exercise. You're there, the decision's presented to you, and then you endorse it. It's not a happy way to be. There's also a lack of personal responsibility amongst the board, because if my board's just simply too big, then he's got it. So why do I need to concentrate in the meeting? You'll find that with larger boards, sometimes attendance can be a problem, and trustees tend to be less engaged and less connected. There was a report in 2013 which looked at the average size of boards, and you can see the results up here on the slides. So most charities have somewhere between about 11 and 15 trustees, and the ideal number from those who were interviewed in this survey they thought was about 13, which is presumably unlucky for some. So my tips, there we are. My tips for burgeoning boards then, consider a maximum board size, and happily the U3A model constitution gives you the option of putting in a maximum size. You might want to undertake a review of your governance and consider automatically removing trustees who don't attend a certain number of meetings in the year. And if they're not going to contribute, what's the point of them, frankly? And some charities, and this is probably a step too far, but some charities actually publish attendance numbers once a year. And naming and shaming is probably a bit too strong, but they make it known to those trustees who haven't always been present why that is the case. Now, obviously, sometimes people aren't there for a reason, but what we want is functioning, streamlined, effective boards, and so burgeoning boards is not a good idea. Right, problem number 2, only 10 more to go. Rotten rotation. So I don't know how many of you follow a rotation mechanism, but in my view they confuse people, and because they confuse people, people sometimes just don't get them right. The reason that it's really important to make sure that you refresh yourselves with your rules in your constitution is because if you're not appointing your trustees properly under your constitution and strictly in accordance with the rules, then those trustees might not be trustees at all. And if something goes wrong and the commission were to come in and have a look, they would be criticising you for not having followed your proper appointments process. Now, some of you might just think that your constitution is there for show, because you need to have a constitution. And you may think, oh, we don't need to have annual meetings to appoint trustees, come on, whatever. No, really do try and follow the rules as set out in your constitution, because you don't want to leave yourself in a position where it's unclear who those trustees are. So the issue really with rotation mechanisms is if they're not applied properly, they can lead to improper trustee appointments. Rotation sometimes is a good thing, because it allows the board to refresh and to renew, and you do not want a stagnating board. I attended a trustees meeting about 8 or 9 years ago now, where the record for continuous trusteeship was broken. This was a failing charity that had run out of money, couldn't fundraise, just had nowhere to go. It was providing an incredible service for older people in a particular borough of London, but they were solving complex issues, and they had dedicated caseworkers who would go in and help families who were really struggling. It was a brilliant charity, but they just lost their way a bit in focusing how to sort of get the money in and how to fund it. I had trustees on that board who, on average, probably had been in post for about 22 or 23 years. So really, it's no wonder that they'd kind of run out of ideas, because I'd have run out of ideas by then as well. But my favourite was an absolutely wonderful, wonderful lady who had been on this board, and I am not joking you, for 41 years. Yeah. Today, in fact, is my last day of my second term of office as a school governor. I hope that my school is not watching the live stream. I am delighted. It's been really, really hard. It's a sort of 2,500 comprehensive inner city London school, and it's an amazing place, but it's been really, really hard work. And sometimes people just need to go. You know, I think I did an all right job, but it's someone else's term, and I am just really pleased to be able to hand over the baton. So don't think of terms of office as getting in your way or stopping you from having the people that you want. It's a really good thing to refresh your board. You know, and if it's all right for them to be there for 7 years, will you still be saying the same thing when it's their 19th year? And really, you should have moved on. So think about refreshment and new ideas, and let's have a look at some tips. Check your governing document. Make sure that you understand the provisions in your document, and keep rotation under review so you always know where you are and who's coming and who's going. Lord Hodgson did a report on the charity sector, I don't know, getting old, probably about 6 or 7 years ago now, and he recommended that 3 terms of 3 years should be the absolute maximum, so that absolutely nobody should be serving for more than 9 years, and that was his recommendation. It hasn't been brought into law, so you know you're still entitled to serve for however long you want, but that was his recommendation, and there's a lot to be said for it. And then also, if you're going to have a look at the Charity Governance Code, that also has quite a lot to say about rotation and how to do it. Right, cumbersome committees. Sometimes there might be something that the board just doesn't want to do, sets up a committee, off you go. You know, you want to set up a study group about, I don't know, give me a subject that you do your study groups on. Psychology, right, a psychology group. Off you go, you know, set up a committee and you can run with it. We'll have a psychology project running for the year. But you don't give them any clear terms of reference. You don't tell them whether they've got a budget or how much they can spend or whether they can pay speakers. And all of a sudden they're incurring costs on behalf of the U3A. And, well, it's your fault. If you're setting up committees, you've got to have some very clear terms of reference. So problems with cumbersome committees. Sometimes you can have too many of them, and they can be difficult to manage. You may have created committees to look in detail at particular issues, and that's absolutely fine. But remember, as charity trustees, you are the ones who are ultimately responsible for the charity and for the funds of the charity and for making sure that things work properly. And if there's a lack of clarity with those committees about what they're entitled to do, it can lead to duplication, it can lead to them incurring expenditure which isn't authorised. They could be holding themselves out as, you know, sort of booking conference centres, or, you know, I don't know what your committees might be doing. So the research has shown that generally the 4 most common committees are an audit and risk committee, finance committee, governance and remuneration, which probably isn't appropriate when you're looking at grassroots movement like U3A. Larger boards tend to have larger committees and more of them. The average committee size, about sort of 4.3 to 9.4 members. You have to see that 0.4 member. And the average proportion of non-board members is about 30%. So committees can be really good and they can be really helpful if you are looking to bring people on within your U3A and you set up a committee and you want to try people out before you invite them to be a member of the executive committee. It can be really good to put people on to the committees, give them responsibility and see what they do with a particular project. But you need to make sure that you've got some very clear delegated authorities and some written terms of reference for those committees. You do not want them going off on a frolic. And I'll give you an example that I worked for quite a large charity and it owned quite a number of properties. And they set up what they called the property committee. So the people on the property committee, they were people who weren't really interested generally in being charity trustees, but they knew their property. They were sort of property developers and property investors. And they were tasked with looking at what the charity might do with a site that it no longer had need for. The next time this committee reported back, they had entered into a conditional contract for the sale of the site. Because they were called the property committee, right? So of course they get to deal with property. You know, what else would they be there for? You need to be really, really clear with people that you are delegating to precisely what they're entitled to do on your behalf. Regressive recruitment. It's echo chambers. It's people like us. It's avoiding difference because we want people who are like-minded, and people who are like-minded usually look like us. But the problem with the lack of diversity of views is that sometimes that means you're missing out on a whole area of skills or experience. And sometimes you can find that boards stagnate. So the research was undertaken by the Charity Commission in 2012, and they looked at ways in which you looked to bring on new trustees. Now, the Charity Commission's preferred methods are open advertisement. So in the case of the U3A, in your local newspapers and on, I don't know, sort of local church notice boards or public authority, library notice boards, that sort of thing, to get the word out there more publicly, to encourage others who are not otherwise connected with the U3A movement to come in and join up. Most charity trustees, I would say, are tapped on the shoulder. Those people are doing a good job. And others say to me, oh, do we have to bother about diversity? Do we really have to worry about it? Because it's hard enough to find trustees, to be honest. It's quite a responsibility and it's really difficult. And are you sure we need to bother with diversity? Well, I'm going to leave you to make your own decision on that. Safe to say that diversity is now felt to be so important within the sector that they've made it one of the principles in the Charity Governance Code. And all the research shows that the more diverse an organisation is, the better that organisation is, the healthier it is, the sort of richer level of ideas. So, regressive recruitment, let's have a look at a few tips. You can undertake a formal skills assessment. I sit on, when I was a governor, am I going to say that yet? It's the 31st. No, I'm still a governor. At the moment, on my school governing body, there are 14 of us. I think 8 of us are lawyers. Lawyers make really, really bad charity trustees. The reason we make really bad charity trustees is we understand our legal obligations only too well, and sometimes we are paralysed by fear. And so we can't do anything. We are really far too risk averse. Risk in a sort of healthy sense is a good thing. So what you want is a balance, a mix of skills, mix of different backgrounds and experience to bring together. So if you balance a couple of lawyers with a couple of, people from industry against a couple of HR people, against, people who have PR skills, you have a much richer tapestry of skills and experience to enable you to move the organisation on. So what have we got here? We've got careful consideration about the manner of recruitment. So if you've got 26 accountants on your board, you probably don't need anybody else with a set of financial skills. So think about when you're opening the call up for trustees to stand forward for election to the executive committee, saying what you want. Say, we love our accountants, but this year we've got too many. If anybody with a different skill set or a different set of interests wants to step forward, and I really haven't got anything against accountants, by the way. Should just say that. Then also a really helpful thing can be sometimes with recruitment is to set out your expectations in a trustee role description. Sam, I'm sort of looking over at you. I don't know whether there's a trustee role description for U3A executive committee members. but something which sets out what you're expecting from your trustees, that can help to persuade and encourage people to step forward. Of course, because they are actually going to be charity trustees at law, and will be charity trustees under the Charities Act 2011, you need to check that they're eligible. So if they are currently bankrupt, or if they've got convictions for fraud, etc., they cannot serve. And sometimes it can be quite impertinent to ask somebody whether they have a standing conviction for fraud. So there's something called the Declaration of Eligibility, which you can download from the Charity Commission's website, which has got all of the eligibility criteria on it, and you can just ask your trustees to sign it. And that way you can make sure that there are no fraudsters in your midst. Okay. There's also some good Charity Commission guidance called Finding New Trustees, What You Need to Know. Ignominious induction. It's quite a good one, that, isn't it? Hope I've spelt it right. No doubt you'll tell me if I haven't. Inducting trustees effectively, keeping trustees up to date with their knowledge. When somebody stands, making sure that they've read CC3, that they know what their duties and responsibilities as charity trustees are. When I became a school governor, there were so many acronyms. It was so difficult to understand what was going on. I don't think I spoke for 18 months. Whereas if I'd have had a proper, thorough induction, people explained to me what the role involved. They gave me the guidance I was supposed to receive. You know, give every one of your new trustees a copy of your constitution, point them in the direction of some of the more relevant Charity Commission guidance. And you'll see that people get up to speed. People generally do take responsibility seriously. They want to do well. They do not want to let other people down. And they will take the time to read through the guidance and make sure that they can make a better impact and be asking some of the right questions on the board. Sometimes people have like a buddy mentor system, which can be quite helpful if you sort of buddy up new trustees with old ones, and then if you've got any stupid questions that you don't want to raise in open forum, you can ask behind the scenes. With larger charities, obviously, it's important to get out and meet the people you're actually helping, but that's brilliant with your movement because you are the people you're helping. And the wider group of people who are attending the U3A, you are as in touch with your charitable objectives as any charity I've ever known, because you are a grassroots organisation. So some of the things that sometimes I'm saying to charity trustees about understanding their charity, fortunately don't apply here. So let's move on to problem number 6. Sickly succession. Okay. So my chairman, Bob, he's been chairman for 2 years. He's absolutely fantastic. We don't know what we do without him. Really, when he goes, we don't know what we're going to do. If that's what you're saying, then you need to put succession planning on your next agenda, because anybody can disappear at any time, and you shouldn't, as an executive committee, be overly reliant on any one person. Now, of course, in any group of trustees, you've got people who pull their weight harder than others. Is that even a thing? I don't know. Some people who work harder, who contribute more, and there's some people who are along for the ride, and we get that, of course. All boards work that way. But you need to have a plan for who are going to be your executive officers of the future. If your treasurer's coming to the end of his term and there's nobody on the committee with any kind of finance background, that's not good enough. You need to be finding that person now. You need to have a plan for succession. I'm often told by a number of my religious clients that they don't need to worry about these things because God will provide. No, that is the answer I'm given. And that may be the case, but sometimes he needs a helping hand. And so what I would urge you to do is to think quite carefully about planning for the future. You don't have long terms of office within the U3A movement, so you're always sort of handing it on, and that's great. But if you know that you've got a particular problem, there's not somebody there who is an obvious chairman, then maybe think about looking earlier rather than later and not allowing it to become a problem. So plan ahead and do think about these things. Muddled meetings. Okay, so the theory goes that you should have the chairman and the vice chairman together, working together. They plan the agenda. It's a really nice, clear agenda. Sometimes it's a timed agenda, so you know how much time you're going to be giving to each item, so that the most important items can be given the right amount of strategic thinking time. But how many of us have been to meetings where the minutes of the last meeting take about 55 minutes to go through? And that really important item, which is budget for next year, is given about 3 minutes at the end of the meeting because there's just not time. So muddled meetings is going to be getting in your way of running an effective charity. And what the chairman of your board ought to be doing is being really clear about what the priorities are for the meeting and what you really need to give time to discussing. Now, it may be that if your chairman knows your board well and they know that concentration wanes towards the end of the second hour and everyone just wants to go home for tea or whatever time you have your meetings, maybe you make sure that the important things come first. Maybe you leave the minutes of the meeting till the end of the meeting and deal with the really key issues first, because running good meetings is a way to run effective charities. So the issues with muddled meetings are simply that they are too long. I have been in trustee meetings that last 5 or 6 hours, and I've wanted to jump after about the first half an hour, so goodness only knows what the others thought. I worked in-house for Diageo, the drinks company, when I was a corporate lawyer back in the day. And I don't know whether they still have it, but they used to have these meeting rooms with no chairs. And the idea was to encourage people to make decisions quickly and not pontificate. So I've no idea whether that research has been proven. But you really oughtn't to be having meetings that last entire afternoons. That's just not a good use of anybody's time. You need to be on it and understand what you're working through. And be making good decisions in a good way. So let's have a look. As I said, tips, planning of board agendas, annual cycle of agenda items. So if your accounts always need to get signed off in October or whatever it is, make sure you've got like an annual work plan so nothing gets lost. So the course of the year, you know that the meeting in January, we always have to reappoint our trustees, or the meeting in June, we always look at new educational initiatives, whatever it might be. And then allocate a time to each agenda item. Now, some boards that I see actually put the time constraints next to the agenda item. Sometimes that just helps the chair sort of call things to order so everyone can see that they've only got another 2 minutes before we move on. We'll come on to talk about chairmen in a minute because they are absolutely critical to this process. We also need to be making sure that you're getting the right information at your meetings. So I don't know, if you're looking at a new proposal, making sure that you've got the papers beforehand so people can think about things and have got time to reflect. And then also making sure that you're spending time together outside of the meetings. Now, in a group like U3A, that's probably not such an issue, but for many charity boards that I work with, they only see each other 4 or 5 times a year. And when they meet, they are making fundamental decisions about £1 million charities with hundreds of staff and thousands of beneficiaries. And if you don't know each other very well, it sometimes can be quite difficult to be getting the relationships right around the table and making the right decisions. So I said I'd talk about the chair. You can probably think of your own alliterative exercises for the chair. But I'm being live streamed and I was told not to be rude. So anyway, cavalier chairs. So for my money, I would say that the key to success of any organisation, more than the chief executive, sorry Sam, is the chairman. I think they are absolutely fundamental. They are fundamental to relationships, to getting the strategy and the vision right, to running the meetings properly. But sometimes chairmen can be dismissive despots. Over-dominant chairs, that's the problem. Chairs who have a board because they have to. That's what the Constitution says. But really, it would be just far easier if the trustees just left them alone to get on with it and they could do their own thing and stop asking me questions because I'm always right. And you do encounter people like that. And I think it is the nature of leaders sometimes that they can be over-dominant and they can be dismissive of other views, especially views that aren't theirs, around the table. And it's really important that if you're going to serve well as a good chair, you are open to discussion, so that others have different views, you're able to give people a voice, everybody is able to participate and contribute. Tips, I suppose. Introducing board appraisals. So in a movement like U3A, it's probably not quite right, but some way, without ganging up on the chairman, of being able to say to the chairman, sometimes you're just a little bit overbearing. So if there was some sort of formal board appraisal system, you would be able to tell the chairman that nicely. Or maybe there's a very, very tactful person amongst your executive committee who could just say very nicely, I'm like the least tactful person I know, but maybe there's somebody who would find a way to say to the chairman, do you know what, I think Jean had a really, really good point to make in that meeting and you just didn't give her much space. Just to sort of allow the chairman to understand that sometimes they can be over the top and just too much. Or sometimes bring in a board facilitator. So if there's really a problem within your U3A, invite Sam to a meeting, get her to come and have a look, and she can be the, sorry, I'm just giving you jobs now, Sam, to come and help out, or maybe to ask Pam to have a word with the chairman. The other thing that seems to come out from the research is that charities seem, I'm not quite sure why, but they seem to do better if they have a strong vice chair as well. So somebody who can stand up to the chairman, obviously support the chairman, but is able to sort of be a good sort of Batman and Robin partnership. Ruinous relationships. Now, normally when I give this presentation, ruinous relationships is about the relationship between the board and the staff. But in your case, there aren't any staff that you're managing. So my ruinous relationship today, and I have shown this to Sam, so she does know this is coming, but it's keeping good relations between U3A and the Third Age Trust. Now, it is a common problem with all umbrella organisations that every one of the individual autonomous charities thinks that the centre is there for them when they need them and need to respond now and urgently. And do you know, I called her at 9 o'clock this morning and it's 10:30 and she still hasn't returned my call. Third Age Trust are rubbish. It's about setting expectations. Quite clearly, it is a small central team that Sam has at the Third Age Trust. It's a brilliant way to have a central body to be able to support a grassroots movement like U3A. They are a brilliant resource, but it's about them communicating properly with you what they're able to do and you knowing what you can expect from them in terms of support. And to sort of grow a healthy relationship between the movement. I mean, they exist for you, of course they do, but they've also got more than one U3A to be helping and managing. So it's just about giving each other some well-earned respect. And I have to say, I haven't been prompted by Sam either to say that. I just had ruinous relationships in my slides and had to find a relationship to talk about. But I do find sometimes with other umbrella bodies that they think the payover to the centre is the biggest waste of money. What do we get for it? We pay them all this money and we get nothing except a crappy newsletter. They are doing a phenomenal job in creating central banks of policies and processes and so much more that they do in order to support everything that you want to do. And so I would encourage you to use them wisely. This is my favourite. Troublesome trustees. So who have we got here? I can't read it on my slides, it's too small. We've got Andrew Multitasker. Comes to the meeting, really happy to be there, but he's also texting his wife to find out what time dinner's going to be on the table, at the same time as he is sending an email because he's very important, he's got lots of business things to do while he's in the board meeting, and he's really not in the room. He's not engaged. He might even be playing Candy Crush or something stupid like that. On the right there, we've got Miss Au Contraire. Really, there's just no point in suggesting anything because she's never going to agree with you because she just won't. We've got Abby Chatterbox. So nice to see you. Let me tell you all about myself at length, even though we're in the middle of a board meeting, not the time or the place. We've got Philip Unprepared. So the chairman had done their job, sent out some brilliant papers. If everyone had read the papers, the meeting could be finished in an hour. But he hadn't really read the papers beforehand because that's what the board meeting's for, duh. We've got Brian Bulldozer. He's the chair after all. No one's going to disrupt his meeting, even if that means he has to close down important deliberations, considerations or discussions. He is just going to get his way. Mr. War Story in the bottom left there. I remember him. My wife's uncle is the etc., etc. So he specialises in tangents, divergence, late entries when the discussion's being closed down. And another thing, disruptive asides, pet issues which he wishes to return to time after time. So he's got a particular bee in his bonnet, and that bee is your nemesis because it just returns at every single board meeting. But there he is, Mr. War Story. And then Seamus Stuck in the Past in the bottom right, really, which is just a shame because we've always done things like this. You know, we've always done it. I don't know why you're making the change. We've always done it like this. I'm a bored. So I'm a bored. If he's bored, then really you need to shake things up a bit, tell a joke, you know, liven things up. He's making a paper aeroplane there. Judy Rebel, who just won't play ball. She's got her very strong opinions, not really interested in collective responsibility or joint accountability or doing her job as trustee, frankly. And Janet Flip-Flop, you're both right. See, you're right. And you're right. And, you know, we're all right. And you do need people who build consensus. You absolutely do. But you also need people who can make decisions. And then there's Toby Made My Contribution. So, you know, he had to sign off the accounts and he's done his bit for the year, so whatever. Your generation don't say whatever, do you? It's very much my 14-year-old daughter's sort of, in fact, it's pretty much the only thing she ever says to me. Right. Okay, so what is the issue? We are all different. We all bring different skills. We all have different personality types. That is why life is so varied and interesting. It is also why sometimes you get difficult and disruptive people. But difficult and disruptive people stop meetings from being effective. Sometimes they even stop things happening properly outside of the meetings. You find that people are going behind other people's backs and sort of countermanding decisions that have been made. It's really, really important that as charity trustees you recognise that you have collective responsibility and you make decisions collectively for the good of your local U3A. And sometimes, unfortunately, things do happen where it's really important that things remain confidential. And where something confidential arises, you know, it's really interesting. You'll never guess what I found out last week. You know, confidentiality is key, especially in a movement where everyone's connected and everyone knows each other. If the trustee board are, for example, I'll give you an example, considering making reasonable adjustments in relation to one of your members' disabilities, and you know there's a particular issue and it's very sensitive, you know, that can't go outside the room. So trustees need to be ensure that they're respecting confidentiality. So I suppose my top tips here. Understanding your duties and responsibilities. There's a brilliant Charity Commission guidance on trustee decision making, which is a good read. Sometimes having role descriptions, if you've got a treasurer, and a chairman. But do remember that no one trustee is any more responsible than any other. So if you've all decided that you can't do finance and you're going to leave the accounts to the treasurer, if the treasurer turns out to be a crook and absconds with all your money, he was no more responsible than you were for getting those accounts right. So you all need to be checking and making sure that you're properly discharging your duties. I would say tackle bad behaviour quickly, but I'd also say do it tactfully, because you are a movement by and for the people, and you don't want to be making too many enemies. But nevertheless, you shouldn't be allowing bad behaviours to continue within the organisation. And consider introducing a code of conduct for the board. A couple of years ago, when I'd been to some really awful board meetings, when people were sort of shouting at each other across the table and just not showing decent and respectful behaviour, went away from that. And in fact, that's when I wrote the article from which these pictures are taken. But we came up with a code of conduct for board meetings, like just really basic, simple rules that are completely common sense, like turn your phone off in meetings, make sure that other people are able to speak, don't talk over one another. You don't need to raise your hands, but have some system of going through the chairman so that discussion can be undertaken in an orderly way. And I think I can make that article available, Sam, if people are interested in that. And then if it really gets awful, do not allow it to disrupt or take your charity or your movement down. If people are leaving your local movement because the chairman is just absolutely intolerable, and you need to rise up and you need to make sure that you're getting rid of the chairman and moving on, because this organisation is more important than any one individual. It doesn't belong to anybody. It doesn't matter if they started it or they're a key influencer in the movement. People have to behave properly. There we are. I hope I haven't started a war. Corrosive conflicts. And this is number 11. Sam, how much time do I have left? I've got 20 minutes left until the break. Okay. So in which case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a couple of horrendous conflict of interest stories. And then I'm going to open up to questions. And if any of you are still out there, you can ask me whatever you like about charity governance. Corrosive conflicts. My favourite corrosive conflict story was a little known gallery that you've probably not heard of, called the Tate Modern. Don't know if anybody's heard of the Tate Modern. So it bought from Chris Ofili, one of its trustees, one of his paintings without seeking the express authority from the Charity Commission. Now, you all know that you're voluntary, and you probably all also know that you cannot be paid for your time in serving as trustees. You can be reimbursed your reasonable expenses that you incur, provided you do so in accordance with your expenses policy. But trustees receiving money of any type, even if they're selling something to the charity, generally will need the consent of the Charity Commission. Now, it's just utterly remarkable, isn't it, that an organisation like the Tate Modern could have got that wrong. But as a result, they were investigating both, I think, by the National Audit Office and by the Charity Commission, who produced a report into what had gone wrong. Conflicts sometimes are not that obvious. So I had a phone call this morning at 7:30 from a panicked charity, and they rang me yesterday and said could they speak to me, and I said I was giving this lecture and I hadn't finished preparing, but they could speak to me at 7:30 in the morning. So anyway, they spoke to me at 7:30 this morning. One of their trustees, they wanted to employ the wife of one of their trustees. So the trustee resigned so that there would be no conflict, and then they started paying the wife of this former trustee, and they wrote to the Charity Commission and said, oh, by the way, this is what we've done. But of course, that's still considered by the Charity Commission to be a benefit to the trustee. So any benefit that is passed to a connected person, a person who is connected with a trustee, is regarded as if you had sort of paid that benefit to yourself. So whenever you are dealing with payments out of the U3A, whether it's hopefully not to trustees, but anybody connected with the trustees, you have to be incredibly careful to manage those conflicts of interest properly, to make sure that if you need permission, you've sought the necessary permissions. And conflicts of interest are quite often at the heart of big governance issues when they go wrong. You know, there's normally a conflict issue in there somewhere. So, for example, you know, a trustee who's providing, I'll give you an example. A few years ago, as a trustee who ran a really great headhunting and recruitment business, and the charity was looking for a new chief executive, and the charity decided that they were going to use their trustee's headhunting business because it seemed like the good thing to do, and they were going to give him he was going to give them a really good rate, a good discount. So they went through the process, they got the necessary authority from the Charity Commission, they passed the resolutions they needed to pay him, and they paid his company for doing this headhunting search. And the problem was it was a complete disaster from beginning to end, and his business did an absolutely appalling job, and they ended up paying close to £20,000 and not finding anybody. 6 months later they were there starting again. Now, it is much, much more difficult, of course, to hold a business to account when the chairman or the chief executive of that business is also a trustee sitting on your board. So my advice with conflicts of interest is, yes, you can manage them, and there are ways of dealing with conflicts if they arise, but just avoid them. You know, you don't want to go there. You don't want to be in the position where you're beholden to anyone, or you're scared to ask for what you're entitled to because you don't want to upset your fellow trustees. So there is really good guidance that the Charity Commission provides on managing conflicts of interest, understanding them, trustees' expenses, paying trustees, and all of that. You just need to be aware that if that ever arises within the organisation, that you know where to look and find it. So my overriding tips for getting governance right is, first up, to know your governing document, to ensure your governing document is fit for purpose. Maybe ensure that good governance is someone's responsibility. So maybe it's the chairman's responsibility, but maybe there's somebody else who's sitting on the board who's looking at succession issues or whatever your governance issues of the day might be. Or maybe it's, you know, you really want to improve the timings of meetings. So maybe you have appoint a meeting secretary who's responsible for sort of trying to bolster the agenda and making them better. Implement annual informal governance reviews. It doesn't have to be anything big, but maybe in your annual work plan you just talk about governance once a year, and you know, how's it been going? How are we getting on as a board? Are we missing any particular skills here? Are we communicating effectively? Are there things we could be doing differently? You know, is our minutes secretary providing the minutes on time? I once worked for a captain of industry who insisted on receiving minutes within 3 hours of the end of the meeting. Because otherwise, he said, what's the point? And there is something like that. I mean, I sit on a number of committees where I sort of receive the minutes in the papers 2 days before the meeting, and I realise that I'm supposed to have done 27 things. And, you know, maybe I would never have done those 27 things anyway, but I might have had a better chance if I'd received the minutes some time before. So, you know, somebody who's just got an eye on governance, and we're not talking about making big changes, we're talking about making little tweaks, making a commitment to governance, to talk about the way you do business. Because if you can just tweak a few little bits and pieces here in your processes and your systems and your meetings and your behaviours, then hopefully we can make you more effective as an organisation. Which brings me on to the Charity Governance Code, which I said I'm not going to talk about, and I'm not, but just to show you that it has 7 broad principles. Organisational purpose at the top, and then leadership integrity, decision-making, risk and control, board effectiveness, diversity, and openness and accountability. And you'll be glad to know that that the foundation, the basic premise of this whole governance code is that all trustees are committed to their charity and all trustees know what their roles and responsibilities are. So that's not even a principle within the code. You know, the code says that's a given. Everybody must come to the table knowing what their duties are, knowing what their responsibilities are, and then from there looking at the sort of 7 elements as it's set out in the code. So on the next few slides, I have looked at some of the principles just in outline that are set out in the code so that you've got a better idea of what's there. It's a really good document. You can read it for yourself. It's nice and accessible, so don't need to go through it. And that's me. Happy to answer questions. I'm going to take me down because that's just too big.
Can you make sure that you wait for the microphone? Microphone? Yeah. Ah, okay. Thank you. Right. Any questions?
Hi there. Bob Duckmanton, Warsash U3A. How important do you think risk management is in governance? I know it was on your last slide, but how important? I think it's really important, but I'd be interested how you feel.
I do think it's important. I think it's key. I also actually think it's instinctive. So over the last 10 or 15 years, risk has become a subject in and of itself. And there are people, risk managers, there are whole departments in big corporations that are set up to look at risk and manage it. The Charity Commission, advises all charities that they have a risk register. They're putting their key risks down and they're mitigating it and working them through. And I think all of that is a really helpful process. It's a really good discipline to make sure that you're thinking about things in the right way. But I actually think that there's a sort of slight danger in putting risk on a separate risk register, because risk is a part of every decision every board makes all the time. And I think whenever you're taking a decision to do anything, frankly, you should be looking at the downside. Oh, what a happy person I am. But you should be looking at what might go wrong and working out, if you're holding an event, do we need rainy weather insurance, or whatever it might be? You should always be looking at the risks. So I think it's fundamentally important. I have to say that I understand why it's put together as a separate unit, but I would much prefer that people embedded the way in which they think about risk in the way in which they take decisions, so that the decisions that they're taking, they're not going forward before they've sort of looked at the pros and cons and the downsides and liabilities that might arise. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sue, no, you don't. Okay. Gentleman, yeah.
In the spirit of alliteration, I'll call this individual induction. But what I'm talking about is that people have some form of training or induction before they become on a board, whereby before the first meeting, the new members come along and there's a briefing as to what and how the committee or board functions. And I've been involved in one of those and also seen these function. I don't recollect you saying this, but maybe I missed it, but I found that a very useful thing.
Yeah. Yeah, not that I'm like really competitive or a lawyer who desperately needs to have covered their base or anything, but let me just show you where it is. So it was under ignominious, which I can't say, induction, which I can't now see, but yes, there we are. I absolutely agree with you. I think it is fundamental to trustees being able to do their job properly, that they understand what they're doing. I mean, it goes without saying. I don't think that being a charity trustee needs to be particularly difficult, but there is quite a lot involved. And because it's governed by charity law, there are some things there that are just not instinctive. So mostly if you apply a common sense approach, you'll be 90% of the way there, but there are some things like, for example, paying trustees or dealing with property, which are just a bit different for charities. So I agree with you. You do need to have a little bit of induction, well, not a little bit, a lot of an induction process to help. But I don't want to be panicking people. Common sense will get you 90% of the way there. And my old boss used to say that, as a charity trustee, you should be considering that you're guarding the charity's assets as if you were looking after a much-loved maiden aunt's affairs, and treating it with the same amount of diligence and respect as if you were helping that sort of elderly relative who you've always loved and valued.
Gentleman behind. Oh, okay.
Hi, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much indeed.
Better than the paranormal?
Oh, yes. What I would like to ask, though, is that, the general feeling of the membership is that we are a bottom-up organisation.
Yeah.
But the problem is that all we spoke about today is essentially a top-down process to make this work. So how, especially with the people who've been in U3A for a long time, how do we maintain the ethos of a bottom-up, and so that people feel that it is a bottom-up, rather than see it as a top-down and, sort of big daddy or big mummy's sort of enforcing us to do things?
Yeah, well, there's no television in my room where I was staying last night, so I read your AGM papers. And I would say that for an organisation of this size, you are doing a really good job of still being bottom-up. The way in which you consult with one another, the way in which you communicate amongst and across the groups, the way in which the voice of local U3As is listened to. Yes, there is an executive committee of the Third Age Trust, but I think they're doing an awful lot of listening. And I think that's key to a grassroots movement like this, to make sure that whoever is sitting on the executive committee at the umbrella charity has still got their feet on the ground, and they still understand what it's like to struggle to get 6 people together for a history talk on a wet Wednesday. If that's a thing, I don't even know if it is. So yes, I do see that I've been talking a lot about top-down, but I think that generally the organisation appears to me to be doing an incredible lot of listening. And that's the case with trustee boards, both at the top level, but also, or the bottom level, whichever level, also at the local U3A level, that they listen to the members, that they hear what the members want, and that your annual general meetings are not just perfunctory meetings at which you go through the process that you have to go through because there are certain things like accounts that have to be filed and approved at those meetings, but you use it to listen. You're only here because of your members. You're only an incredibly successful, blossoming organisation because of your members. And so I'm sure that you will continue to listen to them.
Lynn Gray, Sudbury U3A. I just wondered what your opinion was about the number of trustees on a board. Having been in charities where only some of the board members are trustees, and some of our members don't like the idea of having to be a responsible trustee when they're on a committee, and that is obviously a U3A policy. So I just wondered what your view was and how essential it was for everyone to be a trustee. Thank you.
So it's a bit difficult. Sometimes you find that boards are under the impression that if you don't sign up to be a charity trustee, if you just come to every meeting, participate in the decision making, but don't actually vote, that you're not a trustee. Well, you are. You can't get away from that. You can't just have people attending meetings and not voting on key decisions, and somehow they think they're not responsible. If they're coming and they're participating and they are acting like a trustee in every other thing except they haven't signed the declaration to be a charity trustee, then in all likelihood they're a de facto trustee. So that if there was an inquiry by the Charity Commission, or if something went terribly wrong, the Charity Commission would be looking at them anyway. So they might think that they've been a bit clever by not becoming a charity trustee, but actually their position might be worse because presumably there's insurance within Third Age Trust that's provided to local executive committee members that might not be extended to de facto trustees. So I would say that it comes back to the common sense point. I don't think it's really difficult to be a charity trustee. The size of the organisations that you are, the budgets are manageable. You're not incurring significant liabilities. I would say that it's a privilege to be a member of the executive committee of one of the local U3As. And yes, they do need to worry about their liabilities, but I think you can help them to understand that that's not necessarily something that should prevent them serving.
Geoffrey Horton, Arden U3A, Solihull. On your point of communication to members in your last slide, we have adopted a system of immediately following our committee meetings, publishing the minutes of that meeting immediately, and we leave them on display for all of the members to see, as well as the committee, for 2 weeks after the meeting as unapproved minutes, which of course won't be formally approved until the next meeting, which may take place in another couple of months' time, perhaps. Yeah. Is this, in your view, an acceptable thing or a desirable thing to do? This is something we've taken on to do ourselves, but are we in any way breaching any trustee rules?
No, I think it's an absolutely brilliant thing to do. I think it's fantastically good practice, which other U3As that are worried about members not feeling connected might want to do, because there's no secrets here, guys. You can read the minutes and see exactly what's been happening. I think it's a great idea. I suppose if I've got any note of caution at all, I would just say that you just need to watch out for confidential items or issues, so that if you were discussing, for example, the finances of any particular member, if you wanted to waive the subs or whatever it might be, just need to be careful that you're not breaching confidentiality at any point, and that if there is anything like that in your minutes, you put it in a confidential minute and you don't disclose that. But that would be my only concern, I suppose.
One more, I think. Is there another? Oh, yes. Right.
Hello, I'm Judith Hogg from Warrington U3A. Just when you're saying about it's not too daunting being a trustee, I gather now that banks who, if you want to move your account to a new bank or whatever, are now wanting trustees' personal bank account details. And this is alarming some of our new trustees who are now not sure whether they want to sign up, if that's involved and essential.
I don't know why they're wanting that. I suspect it's just to help them verify identification of those individuals, not because they want to reach in and grab money if the charity runs out of funds. So I'd imagine that it's just an ID process by the bank, because we all know how ridiculously difficult it is to open a bank account these days.
But if the Charity Commission don't demand it, so it seems strange, and it's just putting people off from wanting to be a trustee.
Yeah. I mean, maybe if we can just clarify with the bank that you're using why that is, and I'm pretty sure it's only for their own internal purposes to ensure that the monies, that individual is who they say they are.
It's things to do with money laundering, apparently.
Yeah.
Or something.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, sorry. On your behalf, I would like to thank Jo. I think that was, don't clap yet, I think that was absolutely tremendous. It was entirely...
Microphone.
Oh, am I still here? Can you hear me? Yeah, you can hear me now. I think it was absolutely tremendous. When I first saw the writing, I thought, crumbs, this is going to be a bit, it was wonderful. And the only thing that's worried me is that I think I ought to rewrite my chairman's report now. So you'll have to forgive some of the things that are in there. But anyway, thank you so much. I think our two speakers have been wonderful contrasts, but equally good. And I do thank you.